Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Paul Voss. I am the Managing Director of Euroheat and Power. We are the European organization representing the district heating sector in Europe and more specifically in Brussels, dealing with the European Union. First of all, thanks very much for making the time to be with us this afternoon. I know exactly how many conference calls and different web events you could be in. So obviously the opportunity cost for spending this time with us is significant, and I'm really appreciate it. And I hope you'll find it worth your while. We certainly have a great panel of guests. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of Energy Talks by E.ON, I think it's a great idea, not only because they've been kind enough to invite me as a moderator. The idea here is to bring together a wide group of people from very diverse backgrounds. And I think it's really great when organizations take the time and the trouble to look outside their own walls, to bring in outside perspectives, to discuss and exchange and see how we can do things better and differently, and also tell some of the stories about the great work that E.ON's doing in and around Europe at the moment. Our theme today is digital, efficient, and 100% sustainable, making net zero a reality. So we are talking about the theme of sustainable cities. Now, I'm a district heating person, and it is tempting for me to see district heating as kind of the center of the world, but obviously it's not. And the real story in our work and the work that we're going to be discussing today is not district heating, but it's the city and the needs of the people who live in it. Cities are interesting things because we often talked about them as part of the problem, and they are, in the sense that obviously a lot of the energy consumption and associated CO2 emissions come from cities, because that's where there's the density of demand, and that's where we have so much of our economic activity concentrated. But cities are also and should be a big part of the solution, in the sense that a city is a hub that brings together all this different talent and resource and ingenuity. And one of the lessons I've learned through working on district heating in cities over the years is it's so important to see buildings not as isolated entities, but as part of an ecosystem. And by pooling the resources and ideas and talent that exist in a city, we can do things better and make things better for our planet and for those of us who live in cities. And I'd like to spend the next hour talking with you and with our panel about different ways of doing that. And to do that, I'm going to start by introducing our panel. We've got three brilliant people with us this afternoon, and I can tell you I've really enjoyed getting to know them a little bit better in preparation for this. So Annette is with us, and Annette's going to be first. Annette, excuse me, Annette Blücher, who has a German name, but he's in German, much like myself. Annette is Swedish and is Director of Energy Infrastructure Solutions at E.ON Nordic. Interestingly, she's a lawyer rather than an engineer. Now, so many of the people in our business are engineers, and while I think that's great, I also think it's really important to have people from other backgrounds in leadership positions as well. So Annette's background is in European law, but she's been deep into questions of infrastructure and energy for a good number of years. She spent time working in the wind sector, working on M&As, working in Germany, and is now back in Sweden, taking care of district heating and other local energy solutions, I would say. So I think what I'll do, Annette, if you don't mind, is take a quick opening statement from you, and then I'll move on to our next panelists in sequence. So Annette, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I was actually reading today that according to UN Habitat, that cities consume 2/3 of the world's energy and 70% of the global CO2 emissions. I have to read it from the paper because it's so much. So in my responsibility, I'm actually responsible for one of the solutions, or several of the solutions, I would say, here in Sweden, to actually make cities more not only digitalized, but also less CO2 emission rich. So I'm responsible for providing 10% of the Swedish population with heat every day. And there comes a lot of responsibility as well. But I'm also responsible for making sure that we think outside of the box of district heating and district cooling. So I'm also looking into city quarter solutions, which I really hope that we can talk a little bit more about in this discussion during this hour. But also into cities, we have e-mobility solutions, and also partnerships with customers, municipalities, and also with other providers, like in order for us to be able to digitalize and steer, because this is what we need to do as an energy company. We need to make sure that the city energy consumption can be steered from the future.
Super. Thank you, Annette. Okay, next up is Jens Price-Wolf. Now, Jens Price is the general manager of Enviva Europe, but more than that, he's an energy guy and a biomass guy who spent the last 20 years working on energy and biomass. I believe he started life as a management consultant at McKinsey, but we'll forgive that. Nobody's perfect. And has gone on to do really exciting, interesting things through Dong, which is now Ørsted, Drax, which is a major player in the biomass sector, and now in his role as GM at Enviva. Jens, talk to us a little bit about biomass and how you see it fitting in.
Yeah, as Annette, I have been trying to look at what ways in which you can fathom this big challenge. And I think another interesting point is a quote from Bill Gates' recent book on what we need to do to tackle the climate challenge, that for the next 40 years, every month we have to build the amount of buildings equivalent to New York City every month, both to cope with the population growth and to make sure that we bring the world up to the higher living standards that we enjoy. If we have to do this in a net zero capacity, there's two things that is absolutely paramount that we do, that we both decarbonize that living in the city in terms of transport, heat, energy use that is prevalent, but also that we decarbonize all the materials going into increasing the building stock and the amount of cities that we have across the world. In terms of my vantage point, where we are focusing on biomass as part of the solution, it's extremely important that we continue to have working forests that can provide us with the building materials that can lock in the carbon for a long time and making sure that we have less of a footprint of creating cities. There's a lot of ingenuity and technology that goes into those challenges when you have to build high houses and tall buildings. And then as a byproduct of all that timber production, we should make sure that we use the leftovers, the tops, the limbs, the thinnings in the forest to provide the backup energy to make sure that we have power and heat when we want it. That I think is sort of what I would highlight as a number of the things that we should do.
Thanks a lot, Jens. Great. And last but certainly not least, Andreas Klesser, MD of Avacon Natur in Germany. Now, Andreas is a PhD in mechanical engineering, and we'll forgive him for that as well, because I believe we do need engineers. He's also got a passion for digitalization. He works on distributed energy solutions, and interestingly and importantly, working together not only with cities, but also with industrial customers. I think sometimes when we talk about the energy transition, there isn't enough discussion about the scale of the challenge involved with decarbonizing our industry. There's certainly shouldn't be any idea that we can simply solve the emissions problem by getting rid of industry in Europe, because we need it for all sorts of different reasons. So we rather need to approach it differently and think, how do we maintain the industry and even grow it while still respecting our obligations to the climate? And Andreas has been working, if you'll forgive the image, at the coal face of that for the last years. So Andreas, talk to us.
So thank you, Paul. My name is Andreas. I'm MD from Avacon Natur, as you said. We also believe that heating and the heating sector in cities is one of the major challenges we have in the future. So it's not, as you also said, the middle of the universe, but in my opinion, the heating sector and decarbonization of the district heating is one of our biggest challenges for the future. So we as Avacon, we are supplying more than 100 kilometers of district heating networks, and now trying to decarbonize them in the city, building new district heating networks. And what Jens also said, for us, the city is like a forest. So like a forest where all the information are interconnectable, and we have to connect them digital to use all the waste heat from the one side and reuse it on the other side. And secondly, as you mentioned, we also have a big focus on decarbonization of the industry. So we have a huge project with our partner, that's Gitta AG, where we try to decarbonize the steel industry with hydrogen produced directly out of wind, and then have a CO2 neutral steel production in Germany to decarbonize the secondary products for our customers. So for us, two things are important: connecting and decarbonizing the heat consumption in the city, and secondly, also replacing the old fossil industry by new renewable energies.
Super. Thank you, Andreas. I have to say, for me, a person who spends his time talking about all these things in principle, it's really gratifying and helpful for me to sit with people who work on it in practice each day and to hear about how you're doing and the challenges that you're encountering and the solutions that you're finding. And I hope we can spend time discussing that for the next 49 minutes. Now, just so the audience is clear, we're going to start by having a little panel discussion here among the four of us for 20 minutes or so. And then what I'd like to do is open the floor to questions. I'm sure we have a lively audience out there, and I'm keen to hear from you. One thing on a practical note, if you notice that I'm constantly checking my telephone, it's not because I'm doing my emails, but I'm getting your questions put through to my phone. So trust me, you have my full attention. If you don't mind, I'm going to abuse my role as moderator here and take 2 minutes to share a quick anecdote, which I hope will set the stage for our discussion. When I started to work on district heating, or when I took over as MD of Euroheat and Power, it struck me that the biggest problem we had at the time was that in Brussels anyway, and I suspect in capitals around Europe, there was little or no discussion about heat. So the discussion about the energy transition and the regulatory framework that would be needed to underpin it tended to be limited almost exclusively to electricity and to some extent gas. And then in 2013, I think late that winter or early in the winter of 2014, we had one of these periodic crises that we get where there is a problem with the supply of gas from Russia and some high political tensions. And selfishly, I saw this as an opportunity because I assumed that it would precipitate a discussion in Brussels about heat, because actually a gas supply crisis is a heat supply crisis rather than a power one in practice. And I was right, it did. The European Commission did what it always does in these situations. It convened a very large conference to talk about security of gas supply and what to do about this problem of tensions with Russia over the issue. And I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to position ourselves as an actor with a solution to bring to the problem, because in my view, if you develop district heating, it gives you a much better opportunity to use local resources instead of having to constantly go out into the world and dig up oil and gas and bring it back home and burn it. The only problem was the European Commission organized this conference and invited literally everyone they could find except us. And this caused me some frustration and disappointment and confusion in my early days in this new job. And I kind of wondered what I'd got myself into. Now, I've been in Brussels a while, so I still have some friends here and there. And I called around and I got myself a place in the conference. Problem solved. I thought I'll go there and I'll do my little song and dance and we'll make our point. Except that when I got there, all the other organizations had little nameplates around this big round table, and I didn't. So I stood there not quite knowing what to do, feeling like a trainee on his first day. And then I noticed that the Croatian government delegation hadn't arrived, presumably thanks to some difficulties at the airport or whatever. So I decided to roll the dice and borrow their seat, because it was the only way that I could see I was going to get to make my point. And I sat down there next to the Croatian flag, but I knew the guy moderating the event, so I figured that when the time would come, I'd raise my hand and he'd recognize me and I could get on with making my point. Except that halfway through the event, they changed moderators. And I found myself sitting there really not knowing quite what to do with myself, but I decided I really did want to speak, so I sort of raised my hand. Oh, the Croatian delegation would like to make a statement. And I kind of sat there muttering something about not actually being Croatian and whatever. And I kind of half made my point, but by that point I was so embarrassed and frustrated, and I could see friends around the room from both the gas industry and the insulation industry just killing themselves laughing. And so I sort of left, and I went for a long run and had a long think. And I went to work the next day and told my colleagues the story. And of course, they laughed at me. And I thought, I don't want us to be in that situation ever again. And we spent the next years pushing and pushing and knocking on every door we could in Brussels to try and make the point that you cannot have a European energy transition without a heat policy. You cannot have an energy policy without a heat policy. And you cannot have decarbonization without heat decarbonization. And from my perspective, a good number of years further on, we're a lot better off. But I'd like to hear from each of you about whether you feel that change in your local markets. And Annette, if we can start with you, do you feel heating and cooling emerging as priority topics within the energy transition in your environment?
Well, yes and no, I must say. Of course, we as a big production supplier and district heating network provider as well, with a lot of end customers, is really pushing this, because I truly believe, in particular in the southern part of Sweden, where we do have a capacity problem with electricity, district heating is part of the solution, not only today, but also tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. But in Sweden, I think that the discussions, and the fuel that we are using in our production plants are different, depending on the history that you were here kind of elaborating on the regulation and the political decisions that has been taken for decades before. And in Sweden, the politics has been that we don't use natural gas in the Nordics, or at least in Sweden. So we need to get ready for the next phase of decarbonization. And I think Andreas in Germany is having different challenges with natural gas as have to be decarbonized as fuel as such. So maybe you, Andreas, would like to talk a little bit about your challenge, and then I can continue to elaborate about the next stage of decarbonization, which is my headache at the moment.
Sure, let's get crazy and mix up the order. Andreas, I know quite well the German discussion. I know how prominent gas and oil have been in German heat supply traditionally. How do you see things going these days?
So, as you said at the beginning, the heating discussion is really rising and is really starting to ramp up every day. So what we see, it's not just a question how to deliver the heat. It's all for the for our big partners. It's a question how to collaborate with each other. So it's not just how we can supply anybody with heat or with cooling. It's more how can they integrate these systems into their new build technologies. So it's a big question of collaboration today. So what we are having to challenge today is that we have a big gas infrastructure in Germany that is good and that is really useful for decarbonization in the second step. So for the step 2, hydrogen to green fuels. But now for us, it's a challenge in the heating sector to overcome the challenges of high temperature and integrating renewable energies into high temperature networks. So this is our biggest challenge today in the building stock and in existing heating networks.
Super, thanks. Jens, the UK has it's kind of the anti-Sweden, or at least probably in a number of ways, but particularly when it comes to heat. I mean, the UK made a decision in the 50s and 60s to go down the route of natural gas, and would it, I think, be quite a different country in some ways if it had done that differently. Now, obviously, today, it's politically inevitable that we have to talk about changing that, because you can't simply carry on indefinitely with gas heating and talk about decarbonization. So I know there's a lively conversation in the UK about what to do. I also know that Boris Johnson enjoys making big, elaborate promises. How do you see things going in real life there?
Yeah, well, I think that the ambitions of the UK are clear. And it's. I also think it's clear that the main way in which it's going to happen is through electrification. Mm-hmm. I think that, I mean, you can perhaps tweak a little around the corners by introducing hydrogen into the gas network, etc. But I think it's so, both because of the expense and because of the loss of energy that's involved in hydrogen production, I think it will play a smaller role in this. I think the electrification will, as a part of decarbonizing the heat in cities, is most probably going to be more on the electric side. The way I look at it is I think that UK will have one path, you will have another path in a number of other countries. We are, of course, a global company. We're involved, like E.ON, in these discussions in a number of places. And I think when you have new builds here in the UK, it might lend itself to do some of the same things that has been the policy in the Nordics or on the continent, where you can use the electricity to upgrade the low grade heat and make sure that you take waste heat into your district heating networks. It might not get you to what Andreas says of the high heat, but it can use you as a step and take it part of the way, and then you can use sustainable biomass to make sure that you get to where you need in terms of temperature, and also to provide you with a gap filler when there's less power around, because our wind and solar is not dispatching or providing enough energy all the time.
Where do you see the role of, when you talk about electrification, do you include within that concept the idea of large heat pumps in supplying district heating networks?
Can I just say something here about London, actually on the topic of big heat pumps, because we are just in the transformation in the middle of London, where we have a big natural gas CHP provider and where we are supplying a greater London with heating at the moment. And there we are actually transforming, as you just said, to big heat pumps as well. And this is a natural part of the big London, which is really amazing from my perspective. But also from my perspective, I can also see that real estate developers in the UK is having more and more interest in having solutions that is outside of the normal natural gas provider distribution network, so to speak, so that they have their own close loop of energy.
And I completely agree with that.
Go ahead, Jens.
Yeah, but and I think that's definitely a part of the solution. The thing is, however, that in the UK, those type of solutions are a fairly small part of the total heating scheme. Whereas if you look at places like Odense or Esbjerg or Denmark, Copenhagen, where you effectively have district heating network that covers the vast majority of the population, and you can solve it. And there they do the same thing in it. They will put in large heat pumps to make sure that you can take either wastewater spillage heat or from industrial processes, and they upgrade that and put it on the network, and then they use additional measures in order to get to the temperature needed. So adding biomass to make sure that they have the dispatchable part covered.
Can I ask you guys about hydrogen? And I'd like to start with you, Andreas, if you don't mind.
With hydrogen?
Yeah, hydrogen comes and goes in Brussels as a policy priority. When I was starting out, it was very much a thing. And then it went very, very quiet for a good 10 years. And it has reemerged as a thing to an extraordinary extent over the last 18 months or so. I suspect partly because of really exciting developments in the sector, partly because of a certain degree of desperation from politicians who aren't exactly sure how to solve all of our problems and find hydrogen quite an attractive concept because it's something exciting to talk about and doesn't require necessarily from them any very difficult decisions in the short term. So hydrogen is being sort of touted around Brussels and I think elsewhere in Europe as a solution to all kinds of problems, including, as Jens mentioned, residential heat, particularly by the UK, but elsewhere too. I hear it popping up. My own intuition is that this is, I have my doubts about using hydrogen for the production of residential heat. It seems like a very elaborate way of keeping my living room warm. But I'd like to hear your perspectives, and also particularly you, Andreas, where you may see a role for it in industry, which strikes me as a more promising avenue.
Yeah.
So Andreas, go ahead.
So of course, so hydrogen has a huge potential, in my opinion, in the future for decarbonization of industrial sectors and in transport. In some cases, also in heating, but not in residential heating, but first of all, then in central high temperature heating devices. So as Jens also said before on the net, it's not about the one solution that we are looking for. You can't solve all the problems in the heating sector with heat pumps, and you can't solve everything with hydrogen. But in my opinion, it has a huge niche or a huge part in industry. So if you look at the steel industry, it's really a good possibility to decarbonize the steel that is then afterwards used and produced in the cars. So this is, in my opinion, a real good use case and something where we should follow on. But I agree totally. The last step at the end is firing hydrogen in a decentralized gas boiler in residential heating. I think this is nothing to discuss today. It's about transforming the heating sector with other technologies in the near future.
What about you guys? Jens?
Yeah, I think that the really intriguing thing about hydrogen and why it came up 20, 30 years ago and people thought it would be a good idea and why it has got prominence now as well is a little like, it might sound a little derogatory, but it's a little like fusion in the sense that it has enormous potential. It is endless. There's enough water for us to separate, and if provided we put enough money into it, there would also be enough electricity to actually do the electrolysis and produce the hydrogen needed. And I think we have to think about hydrogen as part of the solution, because that's the only thing today, together with nuclear, that will give you the really massive scale of decarbonized fuel. But the sort of the reality of it is that there exists no green hydrogen to get today. And just to replace the hydrogen that we are currently producing from natural gas and coal, it will take a long, long time to get there in terms of bringing up a green hydrogen production to replace the ammonia and the hydrogen used in the chemical industry, etc. So I would say great potential. Unfortunately, a cost point that I think means that we will have to look at the heat pumps, at the biomass, at energy efficiency, the digitalization of things, etc., before we end up using hydrogen in significant amounts.
Yeah, thank you. Annette?
Yes, I think that hydrogen, I'm looking with curiosity, I would say, in the longer time span. But I'm also looking into curiosity on how it can be used, not only for industries, but also in other solutions. I just read actually the other day how batteries can be combined with hydrogen solutions, and that can be used then to electrify construction transport sector, for example. And that would be super interesting for us, for our whole green footprint and also for our end customers, so that we can reduce the whole value chain. But at the moment, I'm looking with curiosity.
I think that's a healthy way to look at almost anything. Now, I'd like to talk about biomass a little bit, if you don't mind. I read something this morning. So we are about a month away from the publication of a proposal for a new European directive on renewable energy. And I found on the bus the other day a copy of the draft proposal and was flipping through it. And one of the things, and I'd heard this before actually in the preparatory phase, one of the things that jumps out at me is that there's a discussion about whether or not to revise the sustainability criteria for biomass, so the rules governing which biomass should be used and under what conditions and so on. We set a new framework in 2018, and now because there's talk of a European Green Deal and a heightened degree of ambition and so on, things are being redone. And one of the discussions is, should we tighten the biomass rules? And I can tell you there's a lot of political pressure to do that. And there's a big argument over whether it needs to be done at all and how far it should go. And I read this morning in this draft document that while many stakeholders favor essentially leaving the rules as they are because the sector needs visibility and needs to be able to plan, and we shouldn't have too much regulatory instability. The NGO community organized to have 38,000 separate submissions calling for the rules to be rewritten, which somewhat skewed the final results of the consultation. Where do you all stand on this? I know it's difficult when I'm asked, is biomass sustainable? I mean, it's a bit like being asked how long is a piece of string. It depends. Jens, I think you're our main biomass person this afternoon. Where do you stand on all this? And is it possible to view it objectively when you sit inside the biomass industry as you do?
I think it is. I mean, to the comment of the 38,000, we're a European communion of more than 500 million people. So the fact that you can get 38,000 people excited individually to submit the same response as they have received in an email and say, press this button here, and that's a response. I don't think that should necessarily worry us. But it is a worry that we 2 years ago went through all the discussions and arguments to make sure that what can we do to safeguard, because I think it is important that you safeguard the use of biomass to make sure that it is genuinely a carbon saving that you get out of replacing the coal and gas in the systems. Since we had that, I wouldn't see a need to do anything, but I appreciate that there is a political pressure to do something. And change in my mind is all about keeping coal and gas in the ground to make sure that we don't increase the amount of gases that heats the planet. And the way that biomass is used and the way it's coded into the already current strict regulations is that it has to come from forests that are growing, or it has to come from agriculture that is done in the right way. And as long as that is the case, and that is very much, I mean, you can imagine that we use wood in a number of places where we don't see it, a little like when electricity comes into our house, we press the button and we expect it to be there. But if you stop up and think about it for a second, where do we use wood? Well, it's the main part of our roofs, it's in a lot of furniture, it's in a number of other long storage applications. And we should continue to do that. And when you create things from wood and you have productive forest, you end up with what I would call sort of a win-win-win situation, that by using the leftovers, and as coded into the RED 2 and now hopefully into the RED 3, that it's sustainable biomass that you use for energy. You make sure that it's more valuable to have forest that generate more ability for wood to replace the cement, the steel, the coal that we have the cement, the steel that is difficult to decarbonize when we build our cities. And I think, whether the restrictions that come out or the policy that come out of the RED 3 revision, it's hopefully in a way that we can continue to have that very, very positive cycle of forests that produce long-lasting products, that produce a leftover which we can replace coal and gas and keep it in the ground, and then it makes more incentives to people to continue to increase the forest cover. And if I might add one last thing, is that in the in this sort of change or policy landscape, there's not that much time to discuss and understand all the intricacies. And most of us don't understand, or are not, as me, involved with the forest product industry all the time. But it is an important thing to keep alive and to make sure that it continues to contribute if you have any chance to meet the net zero targets.
Well, you sold me, Jens. You know, whenever this comes up, my Swedish constituency tends to get a bit nervous, and I would say they have greeted the idea of yet another revision of the rules with quite muted enthusiasm. Given its extremely important role in the decarbonization of heat in Sweden, how do you see this, and how do you see the long-term future of biomass and heat?
So it's different time spans here that you're elaborating a bit, right? So currently we are having different fuel mixes as in combustion right now, and biofuel is very important, and that is from the Swedish forests, so it's very, actually very near to where we have the production facility. So that is also some detailed here that sometimes is missing, that we actually don't transport the things. Secondly, for us as E.ON, it's very important that we do not, we have a close relationship with the forest owners, which is really an important partner here in Sweden, but that we also do not cut down the trees just to burn them. We actually use the residuals of the forest, the things that cannot be used for anything else. So that is here and now. Here and now for me also, or in the midterm, is also to capture the CO2 that is coming out from this. And in the long term, I can foresee that we need really to think about, and I don't have the answer, is combustion really something? Currently, we are investigating deep geothermal here in Sweden as a free energy source instead. So I think that, which we have been elaborating a bit on here today, that we need to think very diverse here and in different tracks in order to, it's not one solution that will solve the cities, it's several. And at the moment, biofuel is one.
So Andreas, thank you. Thanks, Annette. And Andreas, how do you see this? I mean, Germany is different in all sorts of ways from Sweden. So I imagine that where you're using biomass in Germany, not all of it is local, or at least there may be limitations on how much more you can develop in the future. How do you see this in the coming years?
So I totally agree with Annette, what she said about it's not black and white, and it's in the first step, we need to replace the fossil fuels. So this is the first step, what we have to tackle. And I think this is a transformation period and a transition to net zero cities and a transition to a zero emission world. So for us, or for me, in my opinion, it's too early to discuss about colors of hydrogen. It's too early to discuss about what is the rating of biomass or biofuels. So at the end, we have to replace fossils like coal and oil. So in this transition phase, we have to do several things. And the first step is to replace the fossil energy by new, more renewable energy. And it's not a discussion how renewable is biomass then. And the second step is avoiding really energy usage by efficiency. So, and letting waste heat or waste energy being integrated and recovered in new system. So for me, the discussion is not the right one, because we are in a transition phase and we need everything to replace the fossil fuels.
Thanks a lot. And I think you'll like, I mean, I don't know what the final text will look like when it comes out, but what I was reading this morning looks like there's going to be a lot of emphasis on the potential to use waste heat and cold more than we have done in the past. And that's a really good thing. That was a discussion that really didn't exist say 3-4 years ago in Brussels, and it's really encouraging to see it becoming part of the mainstream policy conversation. Now, I'm starting to get questions in on my phone, and I'm all too happy to read them out. So I've got a few here now, and I'm going to start. So first question from Navid Tariq. If the world is getting warmer, is Avacon Natur also looking into district heating? So, Mr. Klesse.
The clear answer is yes. So we are delivering and operating district heating systems, but and also in the future, and we are now entering the summer time again. We are also looking at combined solutions, like Annette mentioned in the beginning about ectogrid solutions, where we also deliver cooling and not just heating out of one network. So the easy answer, yes, district heating and district cooling is one of our core business.
Super. I'd like to hear about ectogrids as we go, so please find opportunities to kind of weave them into the conversation. But I want to get some of these audience questions in because people have been kind enough to send them. Sven Jundel asks, from your point of view, do you foresee additional political regulatory measures facing and ensuring the Paris Agreement goals? I mean, I'm actually going to start by beginning to answer that one and saying yes, absolutely. I mean, everything has changed over the last couple of years, I think, in Brussels and elsewhere. So we are now going to see the biggest package of legislative proposals that I have known in 15 years in Brussels, and we'll spend the next 2-3 years negotiating the details. And then following 2 years after that, all of this will need to be transposed into national law. So I think the entire regulatory framework is going to change, and the idea is to build one that gets us to net zero. But there's a follow-up question, which is which concrete ones would be most helpful? And there, I'd like to turn to our panelists. So Jens, do you wanna have a first stab at that?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we absolutely need to get right is the ability to create negative emissions. I think we're already on a good path in terms of decarbonizing. With, at least in Europe, I know that there's a lot of countries and jurisdictions where additional political efforts are needed. But if you back to the question, the Paris Agreement, I think every projection, IPCC, everybody else that is sort of thinking about how we get there, says that we need to have negative emissions, and we most probably have to have it also in the industrial sector. So I think there will be an additional need to legislate around that to make sure that there's a framework for which you can create negative emissions, and that will come.
Jens, you've done me a huge favor there by answering the following question, which was on going beyond carbon neutrality and CO2 negativity and so on. So that's a great help. But Annette, maybe I could come back to you on the question of what regulatory mechanisms would be required.
Yes, and first of all, stability. Stability for the energy sector is really A to Z here, right? Because our investments are so long term. So we cannot switch from one fashion to another fashion within a couple of years. That will not help the European population and the cities of the future. So that is one thing. If I would look into, we are also in burning waste at the moment, and actually recycling the waste. And in order to get that fossil free, I would personally really recommend to put a lot more pressure on the plastic question so that we can get the plastics out of and actually sort it out before it getting to the plants. And that is just on top of my head. But of course, the stability for me is also important to limit unexpected taxes to try to force energy companies into a certain direction. That is not welcomed.
I'm sure it's not. Philip Johansson asks about energy storage from hydrogen. Fuel cells produce waste heat which can be utilized. What do you see for the future of such combined heat and power? Thanks. Who'd like to handle that?
Fuel cell.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, a fuel cell it's an improvement of a current combustion engine So it's, of course, you can use direct hydrogen, or you can use methane in fuel cells with a high efficiency in electricity production by using additional the waste heat. But for me, it's just a step like in the boiler industry. So it's not the biggest step in the heating sector that you can achieve. So perhaps something more for the transport sector.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, just to elaborate a bit, I think storage as such is interesting. Storage of heat in salt. I know that there are some projects ongoing with that, and also storage in electricity in a sustainable way here. And we need to be curious also to understand, because I can see that the customers, at least here in Nordic, is curious about, the combination of steering, storage, and electricity and heat, everything in one quarter. And that we need to solve together. And luckily within E.ON, we do own our own grid network as well in electricity, so we can combine that. But there is something there that is combined with storage as a possibility.
Thank you, Jens. Anything in particular on fuel cells?
It's optional. Yeah, I'll perhaps be a little stronger than Andreas. I think it's a little pointless to start using fuel cells for district heating. I mean, because if you first have to do the transformation of either purifying gas or making hydrogen, and then just to put it into something that is more efficient, I think that's a very inefficient way of going about thinking about heating. I believe a lot more in hydrogen in three other ways. One is for those places where it's possible to have a hydrogen source where you can replace the current fossil hydrogen, which is like 100 million tons a year. The second one is perhaps in high energy or transport applications where you can build up a network and use hydrogen directly. And then, of course, in the industrial sector with that comes as well. And then the third one is in the future. If we're going to continue to fly, for instance, you would most probably need to create a fuel at which you can fly, and hydrogen itself would not be possible, but it perhaps possible to combine, or it is at least technically possible to combine CO2 that you have captured from existing processes, hopefully from a biomass facility, and then combine it with hydrogen to create a synthetic kerosene or other fuel that you can use for those type of applications where there are no other solutions.
Yeah, and we're going to need to find these kinds of solutions, because I do think people are going to want to keep flying, and if they can't or won't, that's going to cause other problems for the world, for society. Now, I have a comment here from Christian Lorenz, which I suspect will be somewhat controversial, but that's great. Efficiency has always been overcompensated by more consumption. In other words, the rebound effect will not work. Now, I suspect that it's objectively true that we tend to see a rebound effect after energy efficiency improvements. The question is, what do we do with that information? Is it therefore pointless to pursue energy efficiency, or are there things we need to do differently to see that the rebound effect doesn't follow? Who'd like to have a go? Annette? Andreas?
Yes, I can start maybe, and Andreas can fill in. What's on top of my mind here, energy efficiency we need to work on, because as I think Andreas was elaborating on previously, it does not make sense, for example, to just send out heat in the air. So we need to capture, the excess heat here. So, and then we need to be efficient inside the building and outside in capturing as well. And secondly, I can actually see how energy efficiency is at least influencing the future for us in the Nordics, and that is one part of it. And if I know that, I can actually then steer the production as well, right? So if I know the needs, I can also use AI to actually steer my production facilities as well. So with that, I can also then use less production than needed. And that might go for, that the population here in Sweden is not increasing as much as maybe in other countries or cities. But at least that for me is a natural point of where we are now developing digital solutions in order to follow this development.
Thank you, and that brings me to digitalization, which is sorry. Go ahead, Andreas.
Perhaps to add something on it,
Yeah.
as you mentioned. So for me, it's not just also a rebound effect at this point. So people are not just using energy because they want to use energy or because they want to burn something. They want to burn gas in their boiler. For me, it's crystal clear. It's every energy usage you have, you try to increase your comfort, and our comfort level is continuously going up. So of course, when you reduce at one point again, of course, it's not just reducing everything. It's the zero lane is then a little bit limited, but then your comfort expectation rises up again. When you do not use efficiency, your comfort level is going up like a rocket at the in this case.
Yeah, and I think it put it very much home to me. I can't remember exactly the book I read it in, but if you look back at the Babylonian times, you go back 3,000 or 4,000 years. In order to get light for 1 hour, you'd have to toil the fields for 6 hours and express the sesame oil enough to get you 1 hour at light. Today, because we have had so much efficiency gains on the LED lights, etc., and the cost of electricity production, that today it would be a matter of milliseconds per person that you have to spend of effort in order to create the same amount of light. And I think energy efficiency is absolutely important. It's crucial because we need to accept that we're very privileged here. There's a big world out there that is very much intent on getting to the same living standards that we have. And if we're going to have any hope to keep the climate cool, it's with huge energy efficiencies. But I don't think that we can hold people back and say, well, let's not enjoy the same life as we have. We have to focus very much on that energy efficient part. And then, of course, in parallel, work with all the carbon decarbonization solutions we have that can help us keep coal and gas in the ground.
Super. Now I've got a question here. I'm not sure who it comes from, but let's not worry about that. The question is interesting, and it gets me very excited as a regulatory geek. Can we trade energy as a global commodity to create sustainability across the countries? So now I suppose we're talking about some sort of global emissions trading system. My intuitive reaction to that is that it would be extremely challenging, just because we see governments around the world, despite the kind of general consensus in principle that something should be done, we see radically different approaches from one government to the next, which makes an interconnected governance model challenging. But that's just me. What does everybody else think?
I will venture out. I think we're not going to get it, but we are getting it by proxy. There's an element, there's a number of things in the world that we cannot coordinate on a global scale, but if you take, I'm going a little out on a limb here, but say everybody thinks that children shouldn't work. There's no global regulation to say that, and I'm sure that there's places in the world where it's still the case that you would have child exploitation, but you sort of have a general acceptance of raising standards that goes faster where we are, where we can afford it, and that sort of follows after. And I think that you could make analogies with trade, etc. And I think for the carbon market, there's a huge pressure for decarbonization from populists, from people in cities that are looking around and say, well, I'm a part of the problem, I want to be part of the solution, and pushing it that way. And I think we won't get a global scheme, but we will start getting some of the industrialized world getting closer to each other, and you would get it sort of effectively a little by proxy, that effect.
That's a really optimistic answer. Annette, what do you make of it?
Well, I think that you're probably right, Jens, here. But from my perspective, we need to make it easy in order for us to actually transform and to make the CO2 level less. We cannot complicate things too much, right? So if we do it in this very academic way, which I think will take at least 10 years to develop this kind of model, we are losing time, right? So let's do what we can here and now, very tangible, and make, coming back to your question about regulation, the regulation fixed and firm for some period, so that we understand the rules and can act and behave in accordance to that.
Andreas, anything to add on that?
No, not really. So I also agree. It's a kind of a question of velocity and speed that we need to develop. So, and I think all the international, so big global discussion will slow it down. And I completely agree with Annette in this area.
Yeah. Okay. We're slowly inching toward the end of this, and so I want to kind of zoom back out and ask a few big questions of you while I still have you. And I'd like to talk about optimism versus realism. I mean, it's 2021 today. And if I look outside the windows at my city, Brussels, I don't see a city right on the edge of carbon neutrality just at the moment. How optimistic are you three about the prospects of actually having this done ahead of this 2050 deadline? Are we still going to be talking about the need to get there 30 years from now, or do you really believe that this will be behind us? Let's start with Annette.
Yes, sure. So start with me. I'm on the upper end here. So from my perspective, yes, I'm super optimistic, I must say, because this is on top of my mind every day, that we need to find solutions. We need to also think, as I said previously, about non-combustion solutions. We need to spread out and do a lot of things at the same time. And we also need to capture the CO2 and work in different levels to find 1 or 2 or 3 or 5, maybe different solutions so that we can get there. So from my perspective, definitely, in 2030, I need to be very much on the right path. Otherwise, I have big problems here in Sweden, not only about the regulation, because my kids then will actually be the voters. And I'm sure that they will actually change it for me if I don't.
Are you allowed to vote for your mom?
I'm sure you are. But yeah.
What do you think?
I'm a little less optimistic. I think it's perfectly possible to do it. I also think it's great that we have this political will to do it, and a much better understanding today than we had years past for the need to really push through this net zero solution. I can sometimes get a little worried when I see the focus of the media debate, which is perhaps not as pragmatic as I think we need to be if we want to get there. If hydrogen is touted as the solution and we are all running for that, I expect it would be too expensive to get there, and we'll get a backlash. I think hydrogen is something that we have to pursue, but we also have to make sure that we think about the heat pumps first. We think about the electrification solutions. We think about replacing the existing coal that we are currently using millions and millions of tons of with biomass and other types of renewable energy. So I would say I'm a little cautious and optimistic. I think it's perfectly possible to get there, but I think that we need to make sure that we don't, in the chase for a perfect solution, stops actually acting on the things that we can do now and make sure that we get there in an economic fashion.
So I think we have kind of one each, and I suspect that the answers are, in fact, they are inevitably influenced by where you two sit as panelists. The discussion in Sweden is in one place, and the discussion in the UK is in another. In Sweden, it is becoming a historical inevitability. In the UK, I think it remains a kind of open subject for the moment. In principle, yes, but in practice, there's a lot to do still. Andreas, you're going to settle this. Germany sits somehow in between the extremes of the UK and Sweden. What do you think?
So first of all, so everybody who knows me knows that I'm always dealing with problems optimistic. because in my opinion, you never win with pessimism a game, or you never win a battle there. So first of all, I'm optimistic, but why? It's because we see, or I see, that the change in industry is going up, is ramping up. So hydrogen and steel, and you see other efficiency targets in other industries. Secondly, I see a huge ramp up and of e-mobility in cities. So this is I see in the e-mobility sector and the mobility sector a huge progress until 2030, 2040. And third, I believe that we really can change it in the heating sector. So overall, what we achieve in 2050, I'm not sure, but I'm quite optimistic that we create a better world for our children then.
And just for the record, Paul, I think that the UK is somewhat ahead of Germany, and that I think UK was the first one to legislate around the reduction in carbon targets, and I think that perhaps it's the place where we have gone the furthest in terms of reducing CO2 already, exactly because some economic solutions are being put forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Look, it is 3 o'clock. I have enjoyed this enormously. I really have. I'd like to start by thanking our panelists for making the time to be here and for being so well prepared and so thoughtful. And I'd also like to thank the audience very much for giving us your time and attention, for the questions you sent in. I hope we can do this again. In the meantime, I'd like to wish you all an excellent afternoon, and let's carry on. I mean, it's very clear from this discussion how much work we have in front of us. I think a lot of the people around this virtual room are responsible for delivering it, and let's just carry on. And with that, I hear my dog barking in the basement, and I think it's time to go. So thank you very much, everybody. Take good care, and we'll see you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, everybody.